Okay, so tonight, while that's coming up, we're going to take a look at the proposed final budget for the next school year, 22-23. But before we do that, we're going to take a few minutes to look at where we were, where we are, kind of, because it's not quite the end of this year either, so we can better understand where we're going. Initially, we're going to take a look at the financial results from last year. Those are audited results. We'll take a look at projections for this current school year. As we see with 9 months into this year, the fourth quarters, of course, are most active from the financial side. But we'll look at where we think we're going to be at the end of this year. And then from there, we'll jump into the budget, proposed final budget summary. So looking at the revenues, the middle column is our financial results from last school year. These are audited numbers. So overall, we tallied approximately $173.5 million in revenue. Not surprisingly, about 75% of that is local revenue, which is typical, usually lands somewhere within the 75 to 80% area. If we look over to the column to the far right, that is where we think we're going to be at the end of this school year based on trends, based on activities so far, which is about $180 million in revenues. I said this in committee this past week, that I'm going to mention earned income taxes and transfer taxes often, because those are two interesting things that have happened this current school year. So EIT, or earned income taxes, are kind of in an anomaly state. They've grown this current year at a faster rate than has been expected and has been trended over the past 5 years. Typically, they grow somewhere around 4 to 4.25%. This year, they're close to 7. So we've seen a pretty big bump there. Transfer taxes are even more of an anomaly. We're seeing that line item come in almost double what we budgeted for. The reasons for that, because there were a number of real estate sales at the end of last year that it didn't get booked as transfers until over the summer, as the deeds office kind of caught up. Additionally, we've seen some very large purchases or very large real estate sales, including, which many of you probably know, the Providence Town Center, which sold a month or two ago for about $160 million. That sale alone contributed just a little over $600,000 in transfer tax revenue. Wonderful to have, but also one time and not sustainable going forward either. We can't count on those every year. Is it going, Rich? Oop, I'm hitting the wrong one, that's why. Come on. Trying to get over to the expenses. There we go. So again, down that middle column, we look at the audited actual from last year. We tallied about $173 million in expenses, which was pretty much right in line with where we thought we were going to be with budget. Again, as is normal, the salaries and benefits constitute about 70% of the total spend, which has been occurring since before I've been here as I look through those trends. Projecting 21 and 22 for this current school year, we're looking at the salaries and benefits again to be about 70%, and we're looking at the total to be about $178.7 million, which again is right about where we projected that they would be. So if I stack all of that up, what we can see here is the audited financials from last year. We had a small surplus of approximately $418,000. That is within 0.25% of what we budgeted. So pretty accurate budgeting. This year, again, with a whole quarter to go of operations, we're looking at potentially a $1.3 million surplus, which again is less than 1% of what we budgeted. So again, pretty accurate budgeting. So going forward, where does this get us? So let's take a look at where we think we're going to go from here, now that we've taken a little bit of what's just happened, or where we were and now and where we are. So first, broken record slide, right? These are all the things that we're up against in doing these predictions. Every year, it's the same thing. We're expected to produce a budget before the budget at the state level is done. State and federal make up about 20% of our overall revenues. So again, kind of difficult. However, through trend, we can get pretty close. We also know that in February, the governor comes out with his proposed budget, which is usually a whopper. And then, of course, it gets scaled back considerably by the time we get to June 30th. So looking at the revenues, I'm jumping ahead on my paperwork here. Looking at our revenues, this is what we're expecting. So local revenues, again, like I said, usually between that 75 and 80% of total. We're coming in at about 78% of total revenue. Local revenues, of course, are the big chunk. The big chunks within local revenues are typically real estate taxes, obviously. That constitutes about 2/3 of our overall revenues, plus earned income taxes and transfer taxes. Real estate taxes, we're looking at about an organic growth of about 1.8%, which is going to equate to about $1.6, $1.7 billion of revenue, increased revenue there. That's if we do nothing. So that's at current rate. That's just added growth in assessments. Earned income taxes, as I said before, for this year, overperforming. I don't expect the same performance next year. Like I said, typically they grow about 4.25% year over year. This year they're growing close to 7%. So we're going to have to watch that closely. In addition, the earned income tax is economy driven. The economy is a little bit shaky right now with inflation and such going on. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Transfer taxes, again, overperforming. We're about twice where we thought we were going to be at this time. Again, a lot of one-timers, not a lot of things we can plan on for the future. As far as that type of growth is concerned. The trend for the past 5 years in transfer taxes have been about $2.2 million. We're at about $4.4 million for this year. So we have to watch that number closely. State revenues, about 21% of total. Basically nominal changes here. We don't expect anything big to come from the state. The basic education fund, special ed funding, transportation, a little bit here, a little bit there, but nothing really big to write home about. The biggest increases would happen in the PSERS and FICA subsidies, but those, of course, are based on spending. So if you spend more, you get a little bit more. But we'll talk about that once we get to the expense side as well. Federal, I'm expecting a little bit of a decrease in the federal spending. Why? Because we're starting to wind down on a lot of that COVID ESSER spend. We've spent a big portion of that already through last year and then continuing through this year. So we're expecting that those revenues, of course, will start to wane down. And the idea behind those grants is you recognize the revenue as you spend it. So as we decrease the spend, we also decrease the revenue recognition. So local revenues, this is what we're looking at. A real estate tax, I had mentioned, again, about that 1.8% increase. Earned income taxes, we're doing very strong this year. However, I'm not looking to think that is going to follow the normal trend. In addition, as I said, it's economy driven. I'm one of those nerds that reads all 12 paragraphs of the economic reports that comes out. And I'm starting to see increased concern from economists about potential recession as the Fed starts to fight inflation by raising interest rates. There could be a contraction. I know that is starting to creep up and causing, from my perspective, to be a little bit cautious on that. So what happens when the economy retracts, wages can retract, they can flatten. God forbid there's layoffs or those types of things where our wage base decreases and therefore the tax earned also decreases or levels off at least. Transfer taxes, I just mentioned that. $2.2 million has been our trend over the past 5 years. I don't expect that to change unless I see some real strong evidence that that happens over the next couple of years. And then the other two items are pretty much flat. On the state revenue side, I also mentioned nominal changes pretty much across the board are expected. The only things that have any real meat to them are the FICA and the PSERS. And again, that's because of increased spend, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides. And federal, as I mentioned before, too, going down mostly because of the decrease in the COVID ESSER spending and the recognition of those revenues. So that's pretty much the way I stack them all up. What we're looking at is about $178 or so million in revenue from our sources. Again, like I said before, most of that is due to the dip in the federal spending that we're expecting, and of course, the change in that transfer tax that we know is not going to be sustainable. If I look at the expenditure side of the ledger, wages and benefits typically are about 70% of our total budget. That doesn't change. Salaries and wages, we're expecting approximately $2.7 million increase. A lot of that is contractual, based on our collective bargaining agreement with our association and the various agreements we have with the other groups within the district. So overall professional wages contribute about 1.4 million to that. Salaries, which are for Spring-Forward Cyber Learning, also we have that MOU for that. That includes the course building initiatives as well. And then overall admin and support wages about $540,000. Included in those numbers are those two pieces below for additional wages due to growth and due to growth in need and growth in student need. About 635 for professional, about 113 for support services. Number two pretty much depends on number one. So it's a lot of calculating going on there. But again, as I said before, as you spend more, you pay more in taxes. So the employer taxes, the payroll taxes, looking at that increase about 110,000. And then the PSERS, there was a small change in the PSERS rate this year where thankfully we've gotten away from those 5, 7, 10, 15% increases in that rate like we experienced when I first came here 5, 6 years ago. So that's kind of leveled off a bit, which is great. But the increase in the wages, of course, contributes to an increase in the retirement contributions as well. Medical, I think the district has done a great job at managing those costs through our self-insurance initiatives and keeping those plans in the condition that they are, funding those plans as we do. And we're expecting only about a 2% increase in that line. We look at expenditures that are not personnel related. This is what those look like. So outside services for special education increase of about $400,000 there, which is not bad at all. In the past, we've seen increases much larger than that. I think 2 years ago it was almost $1 million. So that's actually come down quite a bit. Funding for our tuition for our students who go to the Western Center, plus the debt service that goes along with that, our portion of it with the other two districts that also contribute about 190. Reworking our substitute agreement, that's about $150,000, so we can be more competitive with substitute rates with our other districts in the county. And tech plan replenishment, general supplies, inflation, transportation, fuel costs. We all kind of know what that is. It takes a lot to run a 72 passenger bus, almost 80 of those every day. And then we are looking at a decrease in equipment costs, which is actually easier to look at when I show this next slide. And that's about 2/3 of the way down under property and equipment. I'm expecting property and equipment costs to decrease by that $600,000. That was mainly COVID spend for computer equipment. That's why that's coming down. So when we look at everything side by side, again, the 21-22 budget, 21-22 forecast for the rest of this year, and then the budget, we're looking at a nominal increase, actually. A little over 3% is the change to about 183.3 million. Now, when we stack all that up, we do our math, we take our revenues, our expenses. We do have there's that transfer from committed funds for retirement. We do have a fund set up where monies were set aside to help with those increases in the PSERS rate. So we're applying a portion to that, which gives us a net shortfall or gap of about $4.5 million, call it, which equates to a tax impact at this stage in the process, and I'm going to emphasize at this stage in the process, of about 3.8%. As a reminder to the board, the index this year is 3.4%. The index plus referendum exceptions which mainly for special ed increases, is 3.95%. So we are within that window, just so you know. PDE would accept this. I'm not saying we're done. I'm just saying they would accept this if it was put forward. Next, I just kind of wanted to do a slide. It was requested just to show what that means. I mean, what does a 1% tax change mean? It sounds grand, but who knows what that means? It sounds horrible, actually. 1%, and what does it mean to the district and to a taxpayer? I think that's important to know. So 1% from a revenue standpoint for the district means about $1.1 million. 1% tax change to a taxpayer means about $28.74 per $100,000 assessed. I don't know what everybody's property is. I know what mine is, but I don't know what everybody else's is, but that math is pretty easy. So when you're talking about a 3.8% increase, you're talking about $109 per year per $100,000 assessed. And again, the 3.4 is about $97, just under $100 per year. I think it's also important to remind the board about how property taxes work versus how income taxes work, because we never really complain much about the state increasing income taxes. Been 3.07% since as long as I can remember. But their costs keep going up too. Why is it they can cover their costs if they're not increasing their interest rates? Because the baseline increases. Someone's in their job, they get an increase, your taxes went up. You move to a new job, get more money, your taxes go up, right? That's how that works. Property taxes work the opposite way because the baseline stays the same. Assessment in my home within Limerick hasn't changed in 17 years that I've lived there, and it probably hasn't changed since it was built in '99. So in order to increase the revenues accordingly, you're not going to change the base, you have to change the rate. That's how that works. So that's why there's that big difference. Nobody complains. Well, we all complain about paying taxes, of course, income taxes or otherwise. But we don't really complain about paying our state taxes or increases in our state taxes, but they happen every year. Just important to note. So where do we go next? Well, you'll see, you have seen an agenda action item for tonight to adopt this proposed final budget. And again, I'll reiterate like I did at Finance Committee last week. It's a checkbox item, it's a checkbox approval. Why? Because the board is required to adopt a proposed final budget at least 30 days before adopting the final budget. Did I say that correct? I did. Okay, making sure. I don't know if they have all those finals in there, but you get the idea. So that's a checkbox item. We can continue working on the budget all the way up until the gavel drops and you guys vote, and that's how that works. But we are shooting for a May 23rd adoption, which we have in the past, that final board meeting at the end of May, so that my office and the tax collectors have enough time to prep the duplicate and the tax bills to get them out on time for the 1st of July. And then, of course, all the other things that go on in between there, which are also checkbox items. But with that, do you have any questions, comments?
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for the time that you take to present that to during the committee meeting also, where a lot of discussion went on, and here tonight. So I appreciate that. Board comment or discussion?
So after the Finance Committee meeting that we had, I did some digging and reflecting and what have you, and I just want to go back to when there was a surplus for the facility, that was applied as a one-time help to bring down the rate. And I think that, you know, we're still, I think it would be very a derelict of duty to go to 3.8% to our community. So what I'm asking is, what is the feasibility of taking that one-time profit or surplus from the sale of PTC and injecting that into our budget to impact that rate? What's the feasibility of doing that? Or even, I mean, I know that that typically goes into the capital reserve, and I would assume that the balance of, you know, the surplus that the small surplus that we have from this year, if we took those two together, we're looking at, you know, $1 million, which would help bring that rate down.
It would. this year. Next year, you pay for it twice.
But I get that, but we also,
But what I'm saying is that when you kick the can, each year the can gets heavier and bigger. So if you're going to kick the can and pull $1 million out of this budget, that means you have to put the $1 million next year, you have to put that $1 million back into the budget. And then, if the board so chooses, to replenish the funds that you took out this year, you also have to put that back in as well. So you're almost getting a double hit next year.
I hear what you're saying, but the fitness center money, so you're saying that we're paying that back in this budget? Are we paying that back in this budget?
We paid it back. Yes, we did. We paid it back in this budget. The fitness center money was about $960,000 that was left over from that project. That was going back into the capital reserve anyway. Right?
Right.
Okay, so initially, the idea was well, I have to take a step back even farther. The year before that, what we did was we pulled $500,000 off of what was going to be transferred into the capital reserve. So instead of doing $1.5 million in 2020, we were only going to do $1 million. Right. So the next year, when budget time comes along, we want to get back to our $1.5 million, right, that we normally put in there to fund projects, putting roofs on buildings and
Or
those types of things.
technology. I mean, we
Yep.
had a lot of technology.
No, it has nothing to do with technology. That $1.5 million was strictly for Mr. Hunter's projects, property type projects. So when we put $1 million, when we decreased that amount from $1 million, from $1.5 million down to $1 million, we took $500,000 out of that budget that we needed to put back in the following budget, which is this year's budget, right? So we went from $1.5 million to $1 million to $1.5 million, right? What we also needed to do to replenish the funds that we didn't put in that year was another $500,000. That's where that leftover money from the fitness center came in, from the phys ed center came in. So we didn't have to bump the budget $2 million to make up there. We only kept it at that $1.5 million. And we applied half of that money that was left over against that to replenish. Because the original $960,000 was considered spent anyway.
You lost me. I have to say, I'm brutally honest. Okay. And so that money that was left from the fitness center had to go into capital reserve.
That's where it came from originally. That's where it
came
was going.
from, so that it had to go back there. That's my point. This money from PTC didn't come from capital reserve. It's likely a one-time injection because we're not going to see that. As we've said, we don't see, sales that happen like that on a regular basis that we can plan and count on that for every year. What I'm saying to you is, since that was unexpected and not planned for, why does that have to go to capital reserve? Why can that not be injected?
I never advise spending one-time money on operational expenses. That's why, because they're short-lived. Eventually, your bank account's going to run out. That's why. Take those monies, and Mr. Jackson can talk more probably when he does his property report, but you take those monies, you pop them into the capital reserve for that list of projects that is coming down the pike. So maybe we won't have to borrow as much to, to re-outfit or to, rebuild or something along those lines. But I never advise, and I will strongly not advise, taking non-operational one-time deals and applying them to continuing operations and expenditures.
I
And
understand that.
Eventually the road runs out.
I understand that, but I'm also thinking that in terms of, doing the projects and things of that sort, that we're going to need to look at the debt service there. And that would be at a different time, obviously, and not relevant to this, but I have a problem setting aside this money to go towards that when I know that's hanging in the wings. Does that make sense to you?
I understand what you're saying, but again, in order to apply that, you have to apply that to an ongoing operational expense. So you're going to decrease an ongoing operational expense for this coming year that you're going to have to re-up the following year. So and we're not planning on those one-timers coming back in again. So you're going to fall short. So yeah, you may decrease where we are this year, but you're going to double it the next year.
We're going to double it, but what if we applied it specifically to the amount we're putting into the capital reserve? We wouldn't
You're still
necess-
decreasing your operation budget. In other words, each year, we budget for, which is included in here, we budget to move $1.5 million. It's included in Mr. Hunter's budget, to move $1.5 million from his operating budget, which is ongoing operating expenses, into the capital reserve. If you reduce that, you're either going to reduce what's in the capital reserve in the long run, or you're going to take a real big hit down the road on
I'm not-
ongoing expenditures.
I'm not looking to reduce that. I'm just looking to say, hey, this unexpected windfall,
Mhm.
in a sense, has come our way this one time. What is the best way to use that money? That's,
My opinion is to put it in the capital reserve for those future projects that are coming down the road, which are quote unquote one-time projects. Or at least longer lived projects.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Fink, could you put slide 17 back up?
Not without Rich's help.
I guess was my question there is this amount, the surplus from PTC is approximately $800,000, $600,000. So I think slide 17 would show us how that would impact
Slide
the
17.
taxpayers.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That one.
So for $1.1 million, you can get a 1% decrease. So we're looking if we were to put the whole 600,000, maybe not, but at the most, under the 1.1 million. So I'm just kind of looking at where you break it down into per month or per year, what an actual cost in the hands of the taxpayers would be.
Roughly $15.
Thank you.
I guess as the chair of finance, and I think it's a dereliction of duty. We work, the numbers, the math is math. There's nothing fancy with the numbers that are being presented. It represents the cost to operate the district. As I mentioned in the finance meeting, the finance committee will make a recommendation. At that time, the board can do whatever the board wants to do with our recommendation. You can raise it, you can request that it is lowered, but what's being presented is what represents the operating cost for the district. We have a great district. It comes with a cost. People want great programs in our district. They want outstanding teachers. They want great buildings for their kids to learn in. All of that comes with a cost. And the cost that has been presented here, again, is the cost that it takes to operate the district. As Mr. Fink said, this isn't over, but this is a snapshot of where we are right now. We still have the May 10th meeting, and I would advise board members now, tell your spouses you're not coming home that night. We're going to be there as late as we need to be to get to a number. And then the following week, that number will be presented to the board, and the board will make the decision on where we go.
Maybe it would be good to switch property and finance that night so that property can still have their meeting at 6:30.
I have no objection to that. That's fine. Since I chair property, we're not giving up any money this year, just so we know that. Okay.
We'll see.
Dr. Wright, I just want to clarify, because it's not in the action item, but it would be good to reflect in the minutes. Is this proposed final budget reflecting the 3.8% millage increase or the 3.4?
Yes, that's 3.8.
Okay, clarify.
Yes, and in the clarification also is that this is just our proposed budget at this time that we are, would be voting to approve at the 3.8. It is not the
This-
final budget.
This is just for process. This says there's plenty more to come.
And also, Mr. Jackson, please feel free if you think that we would need to schedule another meeting at all for finance, please feel free to do that.
Yes, and one last thing I'd like to leave the board with, and I think I said it a half a dozen times in the committee meeting. Again, the board can do as they see fit. There are 3 buckets. If you want to make reductions, there are 3 buckets. It's called the 3 Ps: programs, personnel, and projects. Like, everyone, that's the 3 buckets that if you want to look at making any changes, that's where your reductions will come from.
Yeah, and just for
Thank you.
some context, having done this dance a few times now, not to diminish sharpening the pencils and everything, but essentially, if you go back to a few slides, roughly 70% of the budget is personnel, and we are contracted or otherwise committed to essentially a $4 million increase. And that's sort of what's bolted to the floor presently. So when you look at the other 2 buckets, that's where conversations can be had, and I look forward to participating in those. But we're dealing with 30% basically, and it's hard to want to continue in a certain mindset and delivery to our community. When those 2 areas, in addition again to personnel, are so important. So anyway, just sharing some context on that.
I
And
think you're, go ahead.
And one last thing, what Ms. Zozowski said, that's an option. If the board decides to go that direction, the board can go that direction. But let's be real clear. The individual that we chose to lead our district from a financial perspective has been very clear in his position of not recommending that. But the board has the latitude to do whatever they see fit.
That's
Thank you,
that's
Mr.
correct.
Schaefer.
And then also, to add on to what Mr. Schaefer said, and maybe to reinforce what Mr. Jackson said, that yes, 70% of our budget is clearly allocated to personnel. And in the past, as painful and horrible as it has been, we have talked about backfilling retirees. We have talked about the needs of the district. Have they changed? Are we able to provide the quality level of service that we want to provide with different numbers? So I wouldn't say that the personnel bucket is completely off the board, but off the table, but I do think that it's less tangible maybe for us as opposed to looking at the other 2, which equally, we don't want to do anything awful there that's going to compromise the integrity of the district. We just have to balance this, right? We have to balance this as best we can. That's it.
Mrs. Hermans?
Hi, thank you, Mr. Fink. I just want to reiterate something because I know that 3.8 can be jarring when you look at that. I think it's been really good conversation at the table. I'm looking forward to talking about this more in committee next month. But when I think along the way with the adopting the budget, there's been some check boxes that we've had to just go ahead and check off. With regards to, for example, like January 24th, when we adopted the preliminary budget, I think there were some questions among the community around, like, why aren't we asking more questions? Are we okay with this number? And I just want to rest assured with the community that we are not okay with 3.8. We're going to be doing a lot of work behind the scenes between now and then to figure out how do we get that tax impact down. And as Mr. Clinton said, right, in the end, it's Mr. Jackson, thank you. Mr. Jackson said, we're going to be, bringing a recommendation forward. We're going to be having the board decide ultimately how we vote on that. And I just don't want the community to think that because we're not asking questions doesn't mean that we aren't doing our due diligence behind the scenes, because this is, as Dr. Wright mentioned, this is the 2nd or 3rd time that some of us are hearing this presentation. So thank you.
Just to clarify, behind the scenes means at the committee meetings. It's not in a private session. It's not behind
which
closed
you're all
doors.
invited to attend.
Yes, those are public meetings.
Thank you for that clarification.
Of course.
Mrs. Dierdorf?
I just had a question regarding the tax bills in July. Are we planning on again including notification about the tax rebate in those letters?
Yes.
Are my notes accurate in that previously there was only 3 community members that participated, but last year, since adopting that practice of sending out the letters, we had 150 residents participate?
That's approximately right, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other board comment? Thank you very much.